The registration officer's hands were shaking before I even put my bag down. I noticed it right away, because I notice things. That is something you learn when you grow up on a planet that will quietly end you if you stop paying attention. His fingers trembled against the edge of the intake desk as he scanned my travel documents, and his large amber eyes kept flicking up to my face and then back down again, like he was checking to make sure I was still there and also hoping I wasn't. I smiled at him. He made a small sound that I can only describe as a whimper wearing a professional disguise. My name is Mara Ellis. I am 22 years old. I grew up in a mid-sized city in the north of England, and 3 weeks ago I received a message telling me I had been selected for the Galactic Union Academic Exchange Program. It was the first time a human had been accepted in 60 standard cycles. The message used the word honored 4 times. It also used the phrase unprecedented circumstances twice, which I thought was a little odd for a scholarship acceptance letter, but I was too excited to dwell on it. I had packed for 6 months, 2 bags, sensible shoes, a first aid kit that my mother had insisted on stuffing with every bandage known to human medicine, and a bag of dark chocolate that I brought for myself because I had heard galactic food could be strange. That chocolate would later become a minor historical footnote in interstellar diplomacy, but I did not know that yet. What I knew at that moment was that I was standing on Vega Orbital 7, a transfer and intake station that floated in orbit above a pale blue gas giant, and that the registration officer in front of me was now visibly perspiring. "Everything looks fine," he said, though his voice had the quality of someone reading from a script while also considering whether running was an option. "Your credentials are verified. Your species classification is logged." He paused at that last part. His stylus hovered over the intake form without moving for a moment that stretched just long enough to be noticeable. Species, human, planet of origin, Earth. He read it aloud very quietly, like he was hoping the words would not hear themselves. Then he stamped the form, slid my credentials across the desk and said, "Welcome to Vega Orbital 7, in the tone of a man who had recently made peace with the unexpected." I thanked him warmly. He excused himself to get water. He did not come back for 11 minutes. I waited in the chair by the desk and read the informational pamphlet about station amenities. It had a map. The cafeteria was on level 4. I made a mental note. The dormitory director, a tall being named Coordinator Seath, met me at the residential wing with the calm efficiency of someone who had been briefed very thoroughly and had spent the preceding hour organizing their feelings. She was polite. She was welcoming. She moved me to a solo room at the far end of the corridor, without explaining why, simply noting administrative allocation, with a smile that did not quite reach her secondary eyes. I thanked her and said the room was lovely. It was, actually. There was a window that looked out over the curve of the gas giant below, all those bands of pale lavender and dusty cream swirling slowly in patterns that had been turning for billions of years. I stood at that window for a long time after she left, just looking, with that feeling I never have a proper word for. The feeling of being very small and very alive at exactly the same time. It was only later, when I went to find the shared common room, that I started to understand that something about my arrival was having an unusual effect on the station population. The common room was on my floor. I had checked the map. It was a wide, comfortable-looking space with low furniture and soft lighting, and several different atmospheric zones for different species preferences. There were supposed to be 14 other new arrivals on this floor, I had been told. Exchange students from all over the Union gathered here for orientation week before the term began. When I walked in, the room was nearly empty. There was a single student on the far side, a young Kethra with iridescent green skin, and 4 long fingers wrapped around a warm cup of something steaming. She looked up when I entered. Then she looked at my ID badge, which was clipped to my jacket, clearly marked with my name and species. Her eyes went very wide. And then, with a grace that suggested excellent reflexes, she picked up her cup and her bag and left through the side door, so smoothly it was almost like she had never been there. I stood in the empty common room for a moment. Then I got a cup of water from the dispenser, sat by the window and thought about what I had seen. I was not offended. I want to be clear about that. I have been the new person before. I know how long it can take to make a space feel comfortable, and I know that strangeness goes both ways. Being from Earth had made me strange to them. That was fair. I would figure it out. I went back to my room and wrote in my journal. I have kept a journal since I was 12, a habit my grandmother started in me when she pointed out that the brain forgets more than it remembers and that feelings are worth keeping. I wrote about the registration officer and his shaking hands, about coordinator Seath and her careful smile, about the common room and the student who left. Then I wrote, Day 1. Everyone seems a little shy. I think I will fit in fine. I closed the journal and looked out at the gas giant again. Somewhere down the corridor, behind several closed doors, 14 other exchange students were, I would later learn, in the middle of a group message chain that had been going since the moment my name appeared on the dormitory list. The messages ranged from confused to urgent to a string of symbols in 3 different alien languages that I am told do not translate directly into English but carry the general meaning of, "Are we sure about this?" A first-year student named Peth, the green-skinned Keth Ra from the common room, had sent a message that simply read, I saw her. She smiled at me. I am going to lie down. I did not know any of this at the time. What I knew was that the light outside my window was extraordinary, that I had made it here against what my mother had cheerfully called impossible odds, and that tomorrow morning was orientation, and I intended to be early. I set my alarm, I brushed my teeth, I turned off the light. The gas giant turned slowly in the dark below, its ancient storms curling and uncurling with the patience of something that has outlasted everything that has ever tried to name it. I slept well. That, apparently, was also considered notable. The test center smelled like cool metal, and something faintly antiseptic, the way important rooms often do when they want you to understand that things are taken seriously here. I arrived 7 minutes early with a pen, a small notebook, and the chocolate bar I had started keeping in my jacket pocket as a general-purpose comfort item. There was a long table outside the examination hall with a sign-in sheet and a very organized-looking proctor who was going through a stack of candidate files with the focused energy of someone who had done this many times and intended to do it well. His name was Vel Austin. He was a sorrel, which meant he was approximately my height, with pale gray skin and large dark eyes set wide in a face that was built for reading expressions. Sorrels were, I would later learn, one of the most emotionally perceptive species in the Union. They could detect stress hormones in the air. They were often employed as therapists, mediators, and apparently aptitude examiners, because the ability to sense exactly how frightened a candidate was proved useful in calibration. He found me very confusing from the first moment. I know this because he told me, much later in the report he filed. He wrote that when I walked in, he had scanned the ambient air as he did with all candidates, part of his standard process, a quiet, passive thing he did without thinking, and that my readings were not frightened. They were curious, alert, interested. He wrote that he had rechecked his equipment twice before accepting the result. At the time, he smiled at me professionally and checked my name off the list. The examination hall itself held 9 other candidates that morning. I recognized Peth from the common room. She had taken a seat at the far end of the row and was now looking steadfastly at her own desk with the focused determination of someone who has made a decision and is sticking to it. The other candidates were from species I did not yet know well enough to read. There was a tall one with translucent limbs sitting very still in the second row. There was a small, dense-looking one near the front with what appeared to be 4 separate sets of eyelids, all of which blinked in slow rotation. There was one that appeared to be made of something like compressed gray moss, but was clearly sentient and taking excellent notes. I found all of them fascinating. I smiled at the ones who made eye contact. 3 of them looked quickly away. One, a pale yellow, being with long fingers, gave me a small, careful wave and then appeared to immediately regret it. Vel Austin stood at the front and explained the structure of the day. 5 stages, he said. The examination was designed to give the Union a full aptitude profile of each candidate, physical tolerances, cognitive processing, psychological stability, threat response patterns, and problem solving under pressure. Most candidates completed the examination over 2 to 3 days. There was no pass or fail in the traditional sense, he explained. The scores existed to help the Union understand what programs each student was best suited for. What he did not say, though I learned this later, was that the exam was also calibrated by species. The Union maintained extensive physiological profiles on all registered sentient species. Before a candidate sat the test, their species' known tolerances were loaded into the system, and the difficulty of each stage was adjusted accordingly. Some species had very high atmospheric tolerances but poor psychological stability. Some had excellent threat response but slow cognitive processing. The exam met each species where they were and measured them against their own known range. The file for humans had been loaded that morning. The file was very thin. It contained 3 survey observations from the 1980s, a note that read data collection interrupted, see supplementary incident report, and a classification that said Tier 0, insufficient data, proceed with caution. Veloston had looked at this file for a long time before I arrived. He had then opened a private insurance query for examiners working with unclassified species. He had submitted it. It had not yet been approved when the examination began, but he felt better for having tried. Stage 1 was the atmospheric tolerance test. We were each taken individually into a sealed chamber and exposed to a series of controlled atmospheric variations, changes in pressure, oxygen concentration, trace gases, particulate levels. The machines recorded how our bodies responded and how long each candidate remained comfortable. The process was calm and orderly. Most candidates were out in under 20 minutes, their results logged smoothly against their species' expected range. I went in. The first setting felt like a normal room. The second was thinner, like being at altitude, which I had experienced on a hiking trip in Scotland when I was 17 and a storm had come in sideways, and I had eaten the last of my lunch, sitting in a shallow ditch waiting for it to pass. The third setting was heavier and warmer. The fourth had a trace chemical component that the machine added to simulate mildly toxic atmospheric contamination. I breathed steadily through all of them. I noticed my body adjusting. I thought at the time I had gotten stuck in a broken lift with 5 other people for 4 hours, and how the air had gotten heavy and warm, and everyone had just quietly gotten on with it. The technician monitoring my results called Veloston in after setting 4. When I came out of the chamber, both of them were standing at the monitoring console, looking at the screen with an expression that I would come to understand was a specific kind of stillness that meant something had happened that required a moment before responding to. Veloston asked very calmly if I had found any of the settings uncomfortable. I said the fourth one had been a little warm. He wrote something down. I later read it. It said, Contritiant reported mild thermal discomfort at setting 4. Setting 4 is the maximum output of the machine. Recommend recalibration check. Result inconclusive, recording as pass. Stage 2 was not physical at all, it was a scan. This was presented to candidates as a routine health assessment, a quick mapping of physiological markers that would help the union's medical office maintain accurate records. What it was actually doing, I learned much later, was measuring baseline pain sensitivity across a range of neural markers. The union used this data to calibrate later stages and to ensure no candidate was placed in conditions that would exceed their safe tolerance. I sat in the scanning chair. The machine hummed. I looked at the ceiling and thought about whether the cafeteria on level 4 would have anything with cheese in it, because I had been thinking about cheese since breakfast. The machine produced results. Then it produced an error message. Then the technician assigned to the scan called a second technician. They spoke to each other in low voices using technical terminology that I did not understand, but the shape of the conversation was familiar. It had the rhythm of 2 people trying to determine whether the problem was the machine or the data. It was not the machine. The baseline pain sensitivity reading for a healthy adult human from Earth, it turned out, sat in a range that the scanning system had no category for, not because the reading was wrong, but because the union's calibration system had been built around species whose pain responses mapped onto a scale from moderate to extreme. The human reading did not map onto that scale in any straightforward way. The machine had produced an error because it was trying to place my result in a column that did not have enough room. Veloston was called in again. He looked at the screen for a long time. Then he looked at me. I was eating the granola bar I had also brought in my jacket pocket. I offered him a piece. He declined. He wrote in his notes, Pain sensitivity scan inconclusive due to equipment calibration mismatch. Candidate appeared unbothered. Candidate was eating. Requesting specialist consult. Recording as pass pending review. Stage 3 was the psychological stability assessment. This was the stage that Veloston had prepared the most for because it was his specialty, and because he had reviewed the theoretical literature on Tier 0 species the night before, what little of it existed, and had seen a footnote suggesting that isolation responses in high-pressure environment species could be unpredictable. The isolation chamber was a sealed room, approximately 4 meters by 4 meters, with a chair, a table, and nothing else. No windows, no screens, no sound from outside. Candidates were placed inside for a full 6 hours. The machines measured stress hormone levels, cognitive activity patterns, and behavioral changes over the duration. Most species found the isolation deeply uncomfortable by hour 2. Some species had to be withdrawn early. The results were used to assess emotional resilience, self-regulation, and stability under conditions of sensory monotony and confinement. I went in at 9:47 in the morning. At 10:26, I knocked on the interior of the chamber door. Velosthan was at his monitoring console. His equipment showed that my stress levels had not moved at all in the 39 minutes since I entered the room. My cognitive activity pattern was calm and rhythmic. Whatever I had been doing in there, it had not distressed me. He stared at the knock signal on his panel for a long moment. Then he pressed the intercom. "Is everything all right in there?" "Everything's fine," I said. "I've been thinking through all the capital cities I can remember, and I'm stuck on the one for Kazakhstan. I know it starts with an N. Is there any chance you have something I could read in there? A magazine, a manual, anything really. I don't want to just sit here for 6 hours if I don't have to." Velosthan did not respond for a moment. He wrote in his notes. At 39 minutes, candidate knocked and requested reading material. Candidate was bored. Candidate was bored inside the isolation chamber. Monitoring equipment functioning normally. The candidate was bored. He did not open the door for some time. He needed to compose himself first. Not out of distress, he later clarified in his report, but out of a profound professional need to think through what he was witnessing before he reacted to it. He eventually slid a station maintenance manual through the document slot in the door. I was very grateful. I read it cover to cover and found the section on atmospheric recycling systems genuinely interesting. At the end of 6 hours, I came out, handed the manual back, and asked if Kazakhstan's capital was in there somewhere. It was not. Velosthan told me it was Astana. I said I had been thinking of the old name, Nur Sultan, and that it had changed, which I had forgotten. He wrote, "Contritiant retained capacity for casual conversation and general knowledge retrieval following 6 hours of isolation. Recommend updating psychological stability scale. Pass." Stage 4 was the threat response simulation. This stage took place in a larger room, designed to look like a generic transit corridor, the kind of space you might move through on any station. Candidates were told they were being assessed on their navigational decision-making. This was not false exactly, but it was not complete. At a set point in the simulation, a threat element would be introduced, a simulated predator constructed from real biological data, something from the Union's records of dangerous fauna from various catalogued worlds. The predator was not real. It was a sophisticated holographic and atmospheric projection, but the sensory signals it produced were accurate enough to trigger genuine instinctive responses in almost every registered species. The point was not to frighten the candidate for the sake of it. The point was to see how they made decisions under acute biological stress. The simulation team had selected a predator from a mid-range threat world, a Tier 2 classification, something large and fast and built to trigger deep prey animal instincts. They had used it in 14 prior examinations. It had always worked. I walked into the simulation room. It looked like a corridor. I walked along it. The predator appeared around a bend in the passage. It was, genuinely, quite large. It had 6 limbs, a low-slung body with heavy shoulders, and a head shaped in the way that heads get shaped when millions of years of evolution have decided that the most important thing a head should do is find prey and not let go. It had eyes built for tracking movement and a sound output that the simulation team had tuned based on documented prey response data across 40 species. I stopped walking. I tilted my head. The predator did the thing it always did, moving forward slowly, using the weight and size of its projection to trigger the cascade of biological responses that made most candidates back away immediately. I said out loud to no one in particular, "Oh, it's like a bear, but with more legs." I took a step toward it. The simulation operator, monitoring from outside, later said that she had never in 11 years seen a candidate move toward the predator. She had, out of pure reflex, reached for the abort control. I reached out my hand toward it, the way you do when you meet a dog you are not sure about, not extending aggressively, just putting the offer of contact into the space between us. The predator, which was a hologram and could not smell me or read my body language in the way a real animal would have, continued its standard forward movement. The operator aborted the simulation. The room went quiet. The predator vanished. I stood in the empty corridor for a moment, then turned around and walked back to the exit. Velosthan was waiting outside the door. He was holding his notepad. He was very still in the way that I was starting to recognize as his particular version of processing, something unexpected.
"You moved toward it,"
he said. "I wanted to see if it would respond," I said. It reminded me of something from home. Big animals usually have more going on than they look like. You just have to let them decide you're not worth the trouble. Veloston wrote something. Then he stopped writing. Then he wrote something else. Stage 5, he said. Then he stopped. He looked at his notepad again. He looked at me. He looked back at his notepad. I am going to recommend you for full marks, he said, and I am going to request a specialist review. I asked what that meant. It means, he said, with the careful precision of someone choosing words to avoid causing alarm, that your results are outside the range of what our current evaluation framework was designed to measure. This is not a problem. It is an administrative note. I accept this. We walked back to the main hall together. At the door, he stopped and asked, with genuine curiosity, if where I came from, large predatory animals were something people encountered often. I thought about it honestly. Not every day, I said. But you know it's a possibility, so you just sort of stay aware. He wrote that down too. Later that afternoon, I received my official exam result. Full marks, all stages. The accompanying document was the longest aptitude report I had ever seen. Not that I had seen many. It had 3 appendices. I read it that evening by the window, while the gas giant turned below me, and I thought it was very thorough and very kind, and I made a note in my journal that Veloston seemed like a good person, even if he did look slightly haunted every time he looked at my file. The Stage 4 simulation operator submitted a separate report that evening, requesting that the Predator Selection Protocol be reviewed for future human candidates. Her final line read, recommend sourcing from Tier 4 minimum. Possibly Tier 5. Possibly reconsider the whole format. No one had told me yet what any of the tiers meant. That conversation was coming. The office of Director Sally Veth was on the administrative level of Vega Orbital 7, and it had the feel of a room that was used to containing serious conversations. The walls were a calm, neutral blue-gray. The desk was wide and clear except for 2 data tablets and a small framed image that I could not quite read from where I was sitting. The chairs were designed for multiple body types, which I appreciated, and there was a water dispenser in the corner that I noticed because I had been walking for a while and was a little thirsty. I had been told this was my academic advising appointment. The message had arrived the morning after my aptitude exam results, written in clear standard language and requesting my presence at my earliest availability. I had come the next morning. I had brought my notebook. Director Sally Veth was not what I expected from someone whose door sign read Division of Xenobiological Study and Union Integration, though I am not entirely sure what I had expected. She was a Velsorath, a species I had looked up the night before, tall, with long faces and dark horizontal pupils, known for precision in thinking and a direct communication style. She stood when I came in, which I had learned from my reading, was a Velsorath gesture of acknowledgement towards someone they considered significant. I was not sure if I was significant. I had assumed I was just the new student. She introduced herself and invited me to sit. She poured 2 cups of water from the dispenser before I could ask. She sat down across from me and folded her hands on the desk and looked at me the way people look when they have been rehearsing what to say and are now checking whether the rehearsed version still fits the room. I want to begin, she said, by telling you that you have done nothing wrong and that this conversation is not a consequence of any failure on your part. I told her I hadn't thought it was. She wrote a small note on one of her tablets. I could not see what it said, but the speed of the note suggested it had been waiting for just that kind of answer. I want to talk to you about Earth, she said, and about what the Galactic Union knows about it. I said that sounded interesting. She pulled up a file on the large display behind her desk. It was the kind of file that had clearly been organized by someone careful, sections separated, language precise, with data columns and summary boxes. At the top of the first page was a header that I read with growing curiosity. Earth Planetary Survey Report. Classification. Tier 0 access level. Restricted. I asked why it was restricted. Because, Sally Veth said, it is the kind of information that tends to produce strong reactions in most species, and the Union prefers to manage the context in which it is shared. She explained the tier system to me. It was a Union-wide classification applied to every cataloged planet, based on the survivability index for a baseline sentient life form. Tier 5 was the gentlest end, worlds with stable atmospheres, calm climates, low predation pressure, rich food resources, and gentle geological activity. Most of the Union's founding species came from Tier 4 or 5 worlds. Life on those planets was not without challenge, but the planet itself was not actively working against you. Tier 3 worlds had meaningful environmental pressure, seasons with real consequences, weather that required preparation, fauna with genuine danger if you were careless. Most Tier 3 species had a deep cultural history of respecting the natural world, because disrespecting it had historically ended badly. Tier 2 worlds were what the Union called high-pressure environments. Volcanic activity, strong atmospheric events, aggressive predator populations, limited safe zones. Species from Tier 2 worlds tended to be, by Union standards, unusually resilient. They also tended to have very intense cultural practices around survival, community, and endurance. Tier 1 was rare, only a handful of catalogued worlds. The survey teams that visited them wore full environmental protection gear and did not stay long. Life existed there, but it was described in Union documents as extreme adaptation success, meaning that whatever was alive on those worlds had survived not because the world was kind to it, but in spite of the fact that the world had spent millions of years trying every possible method of ending it. Tier 0, Saliveth said, was not intended to be a real classification when it was created. It was a theoretical designation, a bottom boundary marker, included in the original tier framework, the way engineers include a maximum load warning, on a structure they have built well past normal requirements. It was there to define a limit that was not expected to ever be needed. I looked at the file behind her. I looked at the header again. Earth, I said. Earth, she confirmed. There was a pause. I want to read you something from the survey report, she said, if that is all right. I told her to go ahead. She read from the file in a measured, careful voice, and as she read, I watched her face. And I noticed the small, nearly invisible tightening around her eyes that I had started to associate with people here when they talked about my planet. The report described Earth's axial tilt and the violent temperature swings it produced across the year. It described the oceanic systems and how liquid water, present in enormous quantities across most of the planet's surface, acted as a driver for atmospheric events of extreme power. Storms that crossed entire continents, systems that sustained themselves over open water, and made landfall with the force of something that had been building its strength for days. It described the geological structure of the planet's crust, divided into massive plates that ground against each other constantly, producing seismic events and volcanic eruptions with no predictable schedule, simply whenever the pressure reached a threshold, and the threshold was not low. It described the biosphere. This was the section where Saliveth's voice, already careful, became something I could only describe as clinically deliberate. She was reading the way a doctor reads a difficult result, not hiding anything, but handling the information with both hands. The survey team had documented approximately 8.7 million named species on the surface and in the oceans of Earth, of which a significant percentage had developed some form of active biological defense. Toxins, venoms, crushing force, sharp edges, camouflage systems designed to hunt rather than hide, chemical signals that paralyzed, and organisms so small they could enter a body without detection and dismantle it from within. The report noted that the standard Tier 1 biosphere assessment assumed perhaps 15 to 20% of a fauna represented significant threat potential. Earth's figure had been revised 3 times upward before the survey team stopped revising it. There was a footnote that read, "Threat fauna percentage estimate abandoned. Recommend entire biosphere treated as high risk until further study." I said, "That sounds about right." Saliveth paused in her reading. She looked at me. I said, "I mean, most things you encounter are fine. You just don't touch things you don't know yet." She wrote a note on her tablet. Then she looked at the note. Then she added something to the note. She continued reading. The survey team, she told me, had visited Earth in what I would know as the 1980s. There had been 4 members. The mission had been a standard reconnaissance survey, the same kind the Union conducted on every newly detected world that showed signs of complex life. They had arrived in a masked vessel, spent 11 days making observations, and then departed. 2 of the 4 members had requested immediate reassignment to administrative roles upon returning. One had taken an extended leave of absence that had, Saliveth noted, not been short. The 4th, a highly experienced senior surveyor named Oreth Kahl, had filed his mission report 93 days after returning. It was 204 pages long. The title of the report was a single word. In the standard translation into English, the word was no. I asked what it was no to. Saliveth said it was no to the suggestion, implicit in all standard survey reports, that the Union should at some point establish contact, build a relationship, and potentially pursue integration with the observed species. The report's contents, she said, were thorough. They covered every aspect of human civilization that the team had been able to observe from a safe distance. The technology, the communication systems, the social structures, the wars, The fact that humans had been at continuous war with each other in some region of the planet for every single year of recorded history, and had still, despite this, built cities and art and mathematics and medicine, and had sent machines beyond their own atmosphere and called it the beginning of something. I sat with that for a moment. Oreth Gal wrote in his concluding section, Saliveth said, that in 40 years of survey work across 63 worlds, he had never encountered a species that he found genuinely difficult to assess. He wrote that humans were the first. He wrote that the standard frameworks for species evaluation, designed across thousands of years of Union expansion, did not produce consistent results when applied to humans. He wrote that humans did not fit the expected relationship between environment difficulty and developmental capacity, that a species from a Tier 0 world should not, by any model the Union possessed, have reached the point where they were able to look upward and begin to ask what was there. I thought about my grandmother, who had grown up in a small town in Wales and had spent her entire adult life curious about everything, who had handed me my first serious book about the universe when I was 8, and had said, with complete confidence, "You're going to need to understand this." And yet, I said. And yet, Saliveth agreed. She closed the file. We sat for a moment in the quiet of the office, with the blue-gray walls and the distant hum of the station around us. Then she picked up the second tablet, the one she had not yet shown me, and slid it across the desk. I looked at it. It was a briefing document. Short, 2 pages, with a map of a border region I did not recognize and a summary of a diplomatic situation that appeared to have been ongoing for some time. The other party in the dispute was a species called the Vreth sovereignty. There was a paragraph about their negotiation history. I read it. Then I read it again. They've never lost a negotiation, I said. In 600 years of documented contact with other Union species, Saliveth said, the Vreth sovereignty has not conceded a single contested point. Their diplomatic method is not deceptive or unfair by Union standards. It is simply that they produce a biological response in opposing parties that makes sustained resistance very difficult. I asked what kind of biological response. She described it carefully. The Vreth were large. They were physically impressive by almost any standard. They produced, through a combination of physiological signals and ritualized behavior, a cascade of threat responses in most sentient species, something very close to what prey animals experienced in the presence of an apex predator. It was not something most species could simply decide to feel differently about. It was deep, instinctive, and thoroughly consistent across most of the registered Union membership. Most. She looked at me. I thought about stage 4 of the aptitude exam. I thought about the simulation room and the predator built from Tier 2 data, and the way my first thought had been that it reminded me of something from home. I thought about the bears I had never personally encountered but had grown up knowing existed, and the way that knowledge had never stopped anyone I knew from going to the national park. I looked at the briefing document again. The border system in the map was small, a cluster of 3 inhabited moons around a dim star in the outer region. It was not strategically enormous, but there were people living there, the document said, and the Union had made a commitment to them, and the Vreth had spent 3 years in slow negotiation, turning that commitment into something that was going to end in a way that the people on those moons would find very difficult. "When do we leave?" I said. Saliveth had clearly been prepared for several possible responses. She had notes on the tablet for 3 different follow-up approaches, depending on what I said. She had, not based on the brief silence that followed my question, specifically prepared for immediate acceptance delivered without hesitation in under 4 seconds. She said very quietly that there was a transport departing in 6 days. I said I would need to do some reading on Vreth culture first, and asked if she could send me the relevant documents. She said she would. I picked up my notebook, wrote down the departure date, capped my pen, and stood. I thanked her for the water. I asked if the cafeteria on level 4 had cheese. She said she believed it did. I said that was good to know. I walked back to my room. That evening I wrote in my journal for a long time. Not about the Vreth or the border moons or the strange weight of learning that your home planet had a classification designed for things that weren't supposed to exist. I wrote about my grandmother. I wrote about the book she had given me when I was 8. I wrote about how she had always said, whenever something felt large and difficult, "Well, let's have a look at it then." The gas giant turned in the dark below my window. In 6 days, I was going to a diplomatic summit that 600 years of history said could not go any other direction than the one it had always gone. I read the Vreth cultural documents until past midnight. They were thorough and well-organized and described in clear academic language a species that had built its entire civilization around the concept of dominance as a language, as a complete system of meaning, where the one who remained unmoved was the one who was right. I finished the documents and sat for a while. Then I got into bed. I was not frightened. That, I was beginning to understand, was the whole point. The station at Karath was exactly the kind of place that looked calm from a distance and felt like something else entirely when you were standing inside it. The corridors were wide and carefully lit. The floors were a dark material that absorbed sound, so footsteps disappeared into the space rather than announcing themselves. Everything was clean and ordered and precisely maintained, the way things are when a location is being used for something important, and everyone involved wants the physical environment to communicate that importance without saying it outright. I had been on the transport for 4 days. I had read everything Sci-Fi sent me about the Vreth sovereignty, and then I had found 4 additional papers in the Union's academic archive, and read those too. And then I had spent a day just thinking through what I had read the way I always did when I wanted to understand something properly, by sitting with it quietly until the pieces found their own arrangement. The Union delegation was 6 people. There was Ambassador Lorne Seat, a broad-shouldered Havel with long experience in difficult negotiations, and a calm manner that I appreciated. There were 2 diplomatic counselors, a legal specialist, and a communications officer. And there was me, listed on the official documentation as cultural attaché, human representative. No one on the delegation had said directly that I had been brought along, because I was apparently the only registered Union-affiliated being who had sat through a Stage 4 threat simulation and asked if it was a bear. They did not need to say it. The shape of the invitation was clear enough. Ambassador Thofenseat had been professional and welcoming during the transport journey. He had briefed me on the specific points at issue in the negotiation, the 3 inhabited moons, the resource extraction rights the Vreth were demanding, the settlement guarantees the Union had made to the communities living there. He spoke about the Vreth delegation with the measured language of someone who respected an opponent without understating them. On the final evening of the journey, he had stopped by the small common area where I was rereading my notes and sat across from me. "I want to be honest with you," he said. I told him I preferred it. "The Vreth delegation is led by Supreme Voice Crethanor," he said. "He has personally conducted 47 negotiations on behalf of the sovereignty. He has not concluded any of them in a position that could be described as unfavorable to the Vreth." I said I had read about him in the documents Sci-Fi had sent. "The biological response I told you about," Lorne Seat continued, "is not subtle. It is not something most of my team can simply decide to override. Our legal specialist requested a mild physiological support protocol before we departed. She has used it in prior Vreth negotiations. It helps, but it does not eliminate the response entirely. What the Vreth do is, in its own way, very effective communication. They are not dishonest. They are not threatening in any way the Union defines as a violation. They simply communicate very clearly, through every possible channel, that they are the larger presence in the room. I thought about this. And if someone in the room does not receive that communication the way it was intended, I said, what happens then? Lorne Seat was quiet for a moment. In 600 years of Vreth diplomatic history, he said, that situation has not arisen. I looked at my notes. I looked back at him. It's going to be fine, I said. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded, slowly, in the way that people nod when they are choosing to believe something, because the alternative is not useful. The negotiation was scheduled to begin at the 9th hour of the station's standard cycle. I arrived 10 minutes early with my notebook, my credentials, and the chocolate bar in my jacket pocket. The bar was down to 2 pieces. I had been rationing. The chamber was large. The table at the center was circular, which I had read was a Vreth preference, because a circular table eliminated the concept of a head, and in Vreth culture, the head of the table was earned through the negotiation itself, not given by the furniture. The Union delegation had been seated when I arrived, and I took my assigned place between the communications officer and one of the counselors. The counselor, a young Soral named Vethane, leaned slightly toward me as I sat and said very quietly, "They will enter performing the rite of dominant presence. I want to mention this so you are not startled." I thanked her. I asked what the rite involved. She described it in brief, a formal entrance sequence used by the delegation at the start of all negotiations, involving specific movement patterns, vocalization, and what she described as full ambient projection. meaning that the physiological signals the Vreth produced naturally would be at their deliberate maximum during the entrance sequence. She said that the first time she had experienced it, she had needed to close her eyes and count slowly for approximately 40 seconds before she was able to speak normally again. I asked if she was all right now. She said she had the support protocol and was managing well, thank you. The doors at the far end of the chamber opened. The Vreth delegation entered. There were 5 of them. Crethanor was in front. He was large in the way that the word large does not quite describe. The way a mount is large in its presence rearranges the space it occupies rather than simply filling it. He moved with the kind of deliberate, measured pace that communicated, in every possible physical language, simultaneously, that he was the most significant thing in the room and had always been the most significant thing in every room he had ever entered. He was genuinely impressive. I want to say that clearly. This was not theater in any empty sense. Everything he was projecting was real. The Vreth had built their entire civilization around this communication, and Creth Anor was its finest practitioner. Even understanding it intellectually did not make it less present. I watched him. I watched the way the room changed around him. I watched Veth Ain's hand, which had gone very still on the table beside me. I watched the communications officer, who had not moved, but whose breathing had become quiet in the specific way that breathing becomes quiet when the body is trying to make itself smaller. I thought, he is very good at this. I also thought, he is about the size of a large brown bear, and a brown bear can run at 48 kilometers an hour uphill, and I grew up knowing that, and I am still here. Creth Anor moved through the right. The vocalizations were deep and structured, not words exactly, more like the shape of authority-given sound. The movement brought him to a stop at the far side of the circular table, directly across from Ambassador Lornseat, and then his eyes, which were amber with dark vertical pupils, moved slowly along the Union delegation. They stopped at me. I was looking back at him, not with aggression, not with challenge, just with the calm, direct interest I tend to give most new things. The same look I gave the Stage 4 Predator, the same look I gave the atmospheric chamber, the same look my grandmother had given every difficult situation she had ever walked into. I was curious. He was genuinely extraordinary to look at. The structure of his face, the way his secondary limbs folded at his sides, the texture of the plates along his jaw that shifted slightly as he breathed, all of it was remarkable. I had never seen a Vreth in person before. I appreciated the opportunity. He held the eye contact for a moment, then another, then several more. The rite had stopped. This was, I learned afterward, something that did not happen. The rite of dominant presence had a specific structure and duration, and Creth Anor had performed it precisely the same way in all 47s of his prior negotiations. It did not stop early. It did not pause. The pause it was currently in was not a feature of the rite. Lornseat told me later that the pause lasted approximately 11 seconds. He had counted, because he was a professional, and counting was something he did under stress. In Vreth culture, as I had read in my documents, holding eye contact without flinching during the rite of dominant presence was not a gesture of aggression. It was something else, something their cultural framework had a specific word for, a word that did not translate cleanly into standard, but carried roughly the meaning of one who has not learned to look away, which means they have not yet encountered something worth looking away from. It was, the documents had explained in a footnote that I had thought about for a long time, the Vreth equivalent of saying, "What kind of world did you come from?" I had not planned any of this. I want to be clear about that. I was not running a strategy. I was simply looking at someone I found interesting, the way I looked at everything I found interesting, fully and without apology. Creth Anor completed the final movement of the rite. He sat. The room was very quiet. Ambassador Lornseat opened his mouth, and I am sure he had an excellent opening statement prepared, because he was very good at his work. But before he could begin, I reached into my jacket pocket and took out the last 2 pieces of the chocolate bar. I thought about what Veth Ain had said about managing, and I thought about how long the negotiations were scheduled to run, and I thought about how the single most useful thing any of my teachers had ever said to me was that you cannot do good work when you are running on empty. I placed 1 piece of chocolate on the table in front of me, and then, without particularly thinking about it, I placed the other piece in the middle of the table. Not as an offering, not as a gesture, just the way you put something down when you are settling in for a long conversation, and it seems impolite not to share. I looked at Creth Anor. "It's from Earth," I said. "It's sweet. Long journey, you might want something." The silence that followed was different from the one before it. The one before had been the silence of a room recalibrating. This one was the silence of a room that had run out of the category it was using and was now looking for a new one. Kreth Anor looked at the chocolate on the table. He looked at me. His secondary limbs, which had been folded at perfect angles at his sides, shifted very slightly. I later read his account of this moment, given in an interview published in a Vreth cultural journal 2 years afterward. He wrote that in 47 negotiations, no opposing party had ever offered him anything. Not because the gesture would have been inappropriate, he said. Simply because no opposing party had ever been in a state of mind where offering something seemed like a natural thing to do. The state of mind required to offer something across a negotiating table to the supreme voice of the Vreth sovereignty was, he wrote, a state of mind that his entire professional life had been dedicated to making impossible. He looked at the chocolate. He looked at me. He looked at the chocolate again. What are your terms? He said. The room did not breathe. Not for a moment. Not for several moments. The words had come out in standard, clear, and direct. And they were the words that every Vreth negotiation was supposed to end with. The words that meant the other party had held their ground long enough that the Vreth were ready to hear what they actually wanted. Those words had always come, in prior negotiations, after days of structured engagement, after the Vreth had worked their way through every layer of the opposing delegation's resistance, and found at the end of it a small, exhausted core that was still there and still saying, "This is what we came for." It had taken 11 minutes this time. Or possibly, I thought privately, it had taken 4 billion years, depending on how you counted. Lorne Eats set down his prepared opening statement. He picked up his actual negotiating brief. He looked at me once, a look that I read as something between gratitude and the mild vertigo of watching something impossible happen in a conference room. Then he began. The negotiation lasted 9 hours. I stayed for all of it, taking notes, answering occasional questions, once producing a piece of hard candy from my bag that I shared with Vethane when she needed something to focus on during a complex legal exchange. By the end of the 9th hour, the Union had the settlement guarantees it needed. The communities on the 3 moons had their protections, and Kreth Anor had signed the agreement in the Vireth manner, pressing his primary mark into the document with what I could only describe as the considered attention of someone who was genuinely thinking about what they were doing. As the delegations filed out, he paused beside me for a moment. He said something in Vreth that the translator gave me as, "Your world produces interesting people." I said my world produced every kind. He considered this. Then he made a small movement with his secondary limbs that the translator flagged as an expression without a direct standard equivalent, and walked on. In the corridor outside the chamber, Sali Veth, who had flown out to observe, was standing by the wall. She was not crying. I want to be precise. Her eyes were simply brighter than usual, and she was holding very still in the way that people hold still when something has happened that they have been both hoping for and not quite believing in at the same time. I walked over to her. I asked if she was all right. She said she was extremely well, thank you, and that she needed a moment. I stood beside her and did not rush the moment. Outside the station's narrow observation window, the dim star of the Karath system burned at the center of its quiet space, and around it, on 3 small moons, people who did not know my name were going to be all right. That felt like enough for one day. The enrollment ceremony was scheduled for the 3rd morning of my 2nd week back on Vega Orbital 7. And the station had dressed itself for the occasion in the way that organizations dress for things they have decided matter. The main atrium had clean lighting. The usual background noise of station traffic had been softened, and the chairs arranged in the formal hall had been set out in enough rows to accommodate what the program description called a small gathering of faculty and invited guests. There were considerably more people there than the phrase small gathering suggested. I found this out when I arrived, again 7 minutes early, and found the hall significantly fuller than I had expected for what I had understood to be a routine enrollment confirmation. I stood at the entrance for a moment, reading the room. There were faculty members from several departments, a handful of administrative officials I recognized from the registration process, a group of students arranged near the back who were trying to look casual and not quite managing it, and, in the front row, Velosthan, sitting very upright with a large bound document on his knees. Sali Veth was near the podium. She caught my eye and nodded once, the way someone nods when they are glad you are on time and also glad the moment has arrived. I took the seat that had been set aside for me, which was in the front row at the center, with a small card on it that read Contadidient Ellis in clear printed letters. Peth, the Keth Ra student I had first seen in the common room on day one, was sitting 3 rows back. When I glanced in her direction, she looked at the ceiling with sudden intense interest. I decided I liked her. The ceremony opened with brief remarks from a senior administrative official, whose name I have to admit I did not catch up because I was watching the room. I have a habit of watching rooms. It is something you do when you grow up somewhere that rewards paying attention. You read the space. You read the people in it. You look for what the official version of events is not quite saying. What the room was saying, under the clean lighting and the formal arrangement, was that this was not a routine enrollment confirmation. This was something the station's community had gathered to mark in a way that felt larger than the paperwork suggested. After the opening remarks, Vel Osthen stood. He carried his bound document to the podium with both hands, in the careful way that people carry things they have spent a long time making and want to handle well. He set it down. He looked at it. Then he looked up at the room, and then at me, and something in his expression settled into the particular calm of a person who has made peace with the fact that what they are about to say is true, however strange it sounds. He began reading his evaluation. I had read the evaluation already, the electronic version Sci-Fi had sent me. But hearing it aloud, in the formal hall in Vel Osthen's precise and careful voice, was a different experience. He did not rush it. He moved through each stage methodically: the atmospheric chamber, the pain sensitivity scan, the isolation room and the maintenance manual, the simulation and what had happened in it, and as he had read, the hall was very quiet. Not the quiet of boredom, the quiet of a room full of people who are listening to something they find genuinely surprising and are choosing to give it their full attention. He reached the section about the isolation chamber and the knock at 39 minutes, and I heard, from somewhere in the rows behind me, a small sound that I identified as someone failing to fully suppress a laugh. I did not turn around to see who it was. I looked at the ceiling briefly, which was where I looked when I was trying not to smile in a formal setting. He read Appendix A, which covered the equipment calibration questions raised by my pain sensitivity scan. He read Appendix B, which detailed the procedural review he had recommended for the threat response simulation format. Then he paused, and I knew he had reached Appendix C. Appendix C, he said, is titled The Chocolate Incident and Its Implications. It is not standard to include in an aptitude report. I have included it because the conclusion of the aptitude examination was directly connected to what occurred at the Karath negotiation 9 days later, and I believe a complete record requires an acknowledgement of the chain. He read Appendix C. It was shorter than the others. It described the chocolate, its origin, its function as a simple human comfort item, and the fact that an item brought out of a jacket pocket during a break in Stage 4 of the aptitude examination had some days later been placed on a table in front of the most formidable diplomatic presence in 6 centuries of Union history. He said at the end of it simply, "This examiner has reviewed the aptitude results in full and submits a certification of complete marks across all evaluated stages. No further examination is considered either necessary or practical at this time." He picked up the document and returned to his seat. Sally Veth stood at the podium. She had notes on a small card, and she spoke from them in the measured, precise way she always spoke. But her voice had something in it that I had not heard in our first meeting. Something a little warmer than professional. She talked about the exchange program, about what it was meant to do, about the Union's stated belief that understanding began with contact, and that contact required willingness to meet something genuinely new. She said that the program's founders, in its original charter, had written a line about the value of encountering a perspective that did not fit existing frameworks, because it was exactly those encounters that moved understanding forward. She said, "We sent a survey team to Earth 4 decades ago. The team returned. 3 of 4 members requested reassignment. The 4th filed a 200-page report titled No. We looked at the data and concluded that the appropriate response was caution and distance." She paused. "We were not entirely wrong to be cautious. We were entirely wrong to choose distance." She looked at me for a moment, and I held the look, and there was something in it, acknowledgement, I thought, of all the things that had passed between us since I walked into her office with my notebook and asked when we were leaving. Then she sat down. The final portion of the ceremony was the formal enrollment and classification documentation. An official from the registry office stood and read out the standard enrollment statement. Name, species, planet of origin, academic program, term of enrollment. When he reached the species classification field, he slowed slightly, not because he was nervous, I thought, but because what he was reading had been the subject of significant discussion, and he wanted to get the precise language right. Species classification for human, Earth origin, he said. Following review by the Union Xenobiological Classification Committee, the prior designation of Tier Zest has been suspended pending full assessment. A revised framework for Earth origin humans is currently in development. Interim classification reads as follows. He looked at the document. He read, classification, ongoing, environmental origin, extreme pressure biosphere, full survival adaptation, behavioral profile, beyond existing calibration range. Handling recommendation, approach with curiosity. There was a silence. Then, from somewhere in the rows behind me, someone began to clap. It was a single person at first, and it was the kind of clap that happens when one being decides a thing deserves acknowledgement and trusts that the room will follow. The room followed. The sound built through the hall, and I sat in the center of it, with my hands on my knees, and looked at the card on my chair that said, Contidient Ellis, in clean printed letters. And I thought about a lot of things very quickly. I thought about my mother, and the first aid kit she had packed with every bandage she could find. I thought about my grandmother, and the book she had handed me when I was 8. I thought about the long, dark flight to Vega Orbital 7, sitting at a small porthole window and watching the stars become something I was moving toward, rather than something I was looking up at. I thought about the registration officer and his shaking hands. I thought about Peth and the wave from a safe distance. I thought about Velocithon and the maintenance manual and a word in standard that meant something like bored that I had learned precisely because I had needed it to explain myself. I thought about Creth Anor and 11 seconds of eye contact and a piece of chocolate on a table and 600 years of history hinging on something I had done without a plan. I thought about 3 moons around a dim star and people on them who were going to be all right. After the ceremony, there was a short reception in the atrium. Saliveth handed me a cup of something warm and stood beside me while the room moved around us, and she said, very quietly, that the classification committee had debated for 3 weeks before landing on that language. I asked what the main point of debate had been. She said there had been 2 camps. One group had wanted to place humans in an entirely new tier above the existing scale. The other group had argued that adding a tier above the existing maximum was structurally unsatisfying and set a difficult precedent. I asked what they had settled on instead. She said the current framework had been extended, not with a new number, but with a notation system. The blank field with the red border, she explained, was actually a placeholder in the new framework, a space that indicated that the classification was still being developed as more data became available. It was not, she said, a permanent ambiguity. It was an honest acknowledgement that they were still learning. I thought this was entirely reasonable. I asked if I would be consulted in the development of the framework. She said that had been discussed. She said, the committee had noted that consulting the subject of a classification process in the development of the classification framework was procedurally unusual. They had then noted that given the subject in question, unusual procedure was probably going to be a recurring feature going forward, and that they might as well start as they meant to continue. I told her I was happy to help. Later that evening, I walked back to my room along the corridor that had been empty on my first night, when all the exchange students had relocated to the other wing, and Peth had sent a message saying she needed to lie down. The corridor was not empty now. There were lights under doors. I could hear the soft sounds of people in their rooms, studying and sleeping and existing in the close, ordinary way that people exist when they are living somewhere rather than just passing through. Peth was standing outside her door when I reached my end of the corridor, holding a cup of something warm in both hands. She looked at me. I looked at her. I heard the evaluation, she said, the part about the isolation chamber. I said it had seemed the most honest thing to mention. She looked at her cup. She looked back at me. The capital of Kazakhstan, she said. I looked it up. It is Astana now, but it was Nur Sultan for a while. I said I knew. Velostan had told me. I had not forgotten. She nodded slowly. Then, with the careful deliberateness of someone who has thought about a thing for a long time and finally decided to do it, she held out her hand. I looked at it. 4 long fingers. Iridescent green, very slightly luminous in the corridor light. I shook it. Her hand was warm. Mine, I realized by the way she blinked, was probably warmer, which was just a human thing, our temperature running a little higher than most species expected on contact. She did not let go immediately. She stayed with the surprise of it, and then something shifted in her expression. Not fear, not quite. More like the moment after fear when you realize that the thing you were afraid of is not what you thought it was. And the thing it actually is something you might have liked all along if you had been introduced properly. She said, "My name is Peth." I said, "I'm Mara." She said, "I know." I laughed. She made a sound I had not heard from a Kethra before. A soft vibration at the back of the throat that the universal translator did not flag as a word, which meant it was probably laughter. The kind that does not need a translation because it means the same thing in every language. I went into my room. I sat on my bunk. I opened my journal to a clean page. I wrote, "Day 47. I think I am starting to make friends." Peth shook my hand this evening. It was deliberate and considered, and I appreciated it enormously. She looked surprised by the temperature. I told her that was just how we run. She seemed to find this more interesting than alarming, which I think is a good sign. I put down my pen. I sat for a while in the quiet room with the extraordinary window, looking out at the space beyond the station. All that dark and all those lights. The ones that were stars and the ones that were stations and ships, and the lit windows of places where people were living their lives and figuring things out, and occasionally, if the conditions were right, deciding that the thing they had been cautious about was worth shaking hands with, after all. The galaxy was very large. I had known this, in the abstract way you know things before they become real. Now I was inside it, and it was still very large, but it was also full of details, the kind that had only appeared when you got close enough. I was getting close enough. I closed my journal. Outside my window, the stars did not move, not in any way you could see in an evening, though they were all of them moving all the time, just slowly, in the patient way of things that have been in motion for longer than anyone has been here to watch them. I thought about that for a while. Then I thought about tomorrow, which was a regular academic day, first tutorial session for my enrolled program, 9 in the morning, 3rd floor, East Wing. I was going to be early. I always was.